This is a re-released video, so if you saw the one with this thumbnail, you have seen this content. Thanks for watching. And I forgot about it, and I've got them right out here in the front. Hey there, folks. How you doing today? Welcome back to the channel. Please bear with any background racket that you might hear throughout this production. We are on location where life happens, and sometimes there's stuff going on out there that can be heard in here. Case in point, earlier this morning, it's October. It's nice and cool outside. I had the doors to the studio open. I had a bird fly in here and was knocking stuff off of shelves and having a fit because he couldn't figure out how to get out. Long story short, by the time I got rid of him, there was no way I was doing the video right then, so I had to push it off, but we're going to get it right now. This is going to be a lot of fun. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We hope you get something out of this. If you're coming back, thanks for coming back. And also, if you're coming back, you probably recognize that things have changed here on the set just a little bit. We're not going to talk so much about the things that have changed on the wall behind me today, but I want to focus on the equipment that I have out here in front of me. Now, to some of you, this might be very familiar. You might know what all of this stuff is. And then there's others that maybe you have an idea, but you're not quite sure. And then there's still, on the other end of it, there's going to be people that have no idea what any of this equipment is for. This is going to be part one of a series that, if it takes off, will have multiple parts. And it's something that I have tried to do for a while now and just never got around to. But recently, one of you reached out to me and asked me to do this. So here we are. This video will be geared towards the novice as opposed to the seasoned veteran of hand loading or reloading. And while we're on that subject, some people say reloading, some people say hand loading. Is there a difference? Are they two different things? Well, technically, yes. We're not going to get real deep into that. Just know that for the purposes of this series, if you hear me say hand loading, or if you hear me say reloading, even though technically one's an apple, one's an orange, they're both pieces of fruit, and I'm going to use the terms interchangeably in this format. Some people might disagree with that, but let's not overcomplicate it. So this video is geared towards the person who is a firearm owner, is an avid shooter, and somebody who wants to be more connected to that. And by that, I mean, you have fishermen, and then you have fishermen that tie their own flies. And it's just basically opening up another level to what it is that you do. You have race car drivers, and then you have race car drivers that build their own engines. There are, varying degrees of commitment when it comes to our passions in life. And realistically speaking, if you're thinking of getting into reloading, it's going to be a passion. It's not something that people do that they take lightly. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds with it today, but suffice it to say, if you're thinking about getting into reloading for the economical aspect, it's probably not a good idea. But if you're thinking about getting into reloading for better understanding how it works, for fine-tuning the ammunition that you're using, for being able to shoot old guns that you cannot readily find ammunition for, if you're wanting to develop your own Wildcat cartridge or something of that nature, then certainly reloading or hand loading is really the only way to be able to do that effectively. An example I'll give you is one of the guys that I work with collects old, curio and relic style firearms. And he has several rifles that shoot the, actually had to look this up so I don't say something that's going to offend somebody and get me blacklisted from the internet. The 6.5 by 50 rammed Arisaka. That's not what it's commonly known to the boomer generation, but if you know, you know. It's best sometimes to avoid things on the internet that are going to trigger somebody. So that being said, that ammunition is not in regular supply. Like, you can't just go to Walmart and buy it. You might find it at a store near you, but it's not common. So he was asking me about getting into reloading, and that's really the only caliber he wants to reload for. Whereas there's other people that have multiple different weapons and they want to be able to reload for all of them. They just don't know how to get started. With all that in mind, a piece of advice I would give you is whether you're planning on doing it for just one caliber or you're planning on doing it for a bunch of calibers, pick one and start out with it. Just one. Pick one, become familiar with the process, go through the motions, learn how to do it, and then once you're comfortable with it, you can move on to doing other calibers. Now, with that in mind, a caveat would be please do not pick the 223 Remington or the 5.56 NATO as the first caliber you choose to load. There's a bunch of reasons for that. Suffice it to say, the old guy that's been doing this for more than 25 years told you it probably wouldn't be the best one to start with, and leave it alone. So I was writing some stuff down earlier. I'm going to go over a list of things that you need to have in order to get started, and then we're going to go back and touch on some of those. And I'm going to try to do it in such a way that I don't lose a bunch of people in this video. If you're still watching, that is, after hearing that ramble. Let me start going through these, and these are the major components. These are the things that you pretty much have to get started. First and foremost, you would need a press of some kind. Now, there are many different kinds of presses. There are some that are better at some things than they are at others. And then there's some that are kind of do-all multi-purpose presses. We're not going to get real deep in the weeds other than to say, for the average novice who's either planning on loading for a rifle or maybe for a pistol or both, probably the best option on the market would be some kind of turret press. For the novice that is planning to only load for one rifle, it's grandpa's rifle and the ammunition is not readily available anymore and he wants to be able to shoot it, then you could get away with a single stage press. More on those later. Just know that for the novice, for starting out, we should avoid getting into things like progressive presses, at least for a while. More on that later. After you get yourself a press, you would need to get a scale. The scale is what you use to measure your powder charge, to verify the weight of a projectile, mainly with the powder, but there's multiple uses. You could use it to verify if you were loading like a pistol round and you thought maybe you might have double charged one. You could go back and check and see if one of them was over on the weight compared to the others. There's all kinds of reasons that you would need a scale. There are many different kinds. You really can't go wrong learning to use an old-fashioned beam scale, although the modern electronic ones are pretty good too. More on that later. Hand in hand with the scale, you would need a powder measure. Now, you could spend as little as about $20 on a Lee plastic powder measure, or you could spend several $100s on one. If you look over here at the end of the counter, I've got an old Lyman. I think it's a Type 55 powder measure. I don't even think they make those anymore, but if you could get your mitts on one of those, that's probably the best powder measure I've ever used. I've also got this Uniflow model that was built by RCBS, and these are really good, and you can still get them for about $110. All right, moving on, you're going to need a set of dies. The dies are the precision devices that are used to form the brass and to set the bullets and to deprime the cases. And they are caliber specific. If you have a set of 308 dies, you can't use those for a 30-06. And there's other caveats to that, but just suffice it to say, they are caliber specific, and so you have to have the proper ones for what you're going to use. A lot of old sets of rifle dies were simply 2-die sets, and pistol dies traditionally were 3-die sets. Although now, even with rifle, it's not uncommon to have 4-die or even 5-die sets, depending on what it is that you're doing with it. A lot of that has to do with being able to use them in progressive functions. We're not going to get deep in the weeds with that. just know that the dies are something that you have to be able to reload anything. All right. Moving on from the dies, let's see here. You need some kind of lubrication. You have to have lubricant for the cases. There's a variety of different types of lubrication on the market. I think probably the best product I've ever used is this here. It's called Hornady One Shot. A little can of it like this is $10.99 over on Midway USA. You can get a big can that will literally last you forever for about twice that price. I think they're like $16.99, something like that. It's not something that you have to buy all the time. When it comes to the spray-on lubricant like that, less is more. I actually have a video on making some homemade lubricant. I've got it right here. This is made out of 91% isopropyl alcohol and lanolin. It works really well. It's sticky and it leaves a mess on the cases. So stick with the Hornady One Shot if you're just starting out and you want something easy and that's not real dirty. Okay, so moving on from there, you need yourself a reloading manual. Now, there are a multitude of different manuals available. Some of them have more auxiliary information in them than others. There are people that are of the persuasion that you do not need a reloading manual. They say, I can get the data off the internet. Well, I would caution you to be really careful with that. And if you are getting data from the internet, try to stick to data that is supplied by the manufacturers of the powders. You can't go wrong with an old-fashioned manual. This one right here is Lyman's 48th reloading manual. This one came out in December of 2002. I bought this right about the time it came out, and I've had it for years. It's got a wealth of information in it. This particular book is losing its pages. But kind of like Grandma's Bible, it's probably not the one you're dragging down to all the different meetings and stuff with. So as long as you leave it on your bench, it'll last even in its battered condition for a long time. Another really good manual that's on the market is Richard Lee's second edition of Modern Reloading. This one has a lot of really good information in it. I think you can pick it up for like $20, something like that. I'll put the price up there when I find it. It's a really good book, and it's well written. It's got a few years on it now, but it's still mostly relevant. Then you have reloading manuals like this one that was manufactured by Hornady that are put out by the manufacturers of different types of projectiles. They tend to be a little more expensive, and they also tend to be narrowly focused on the projectiles that company produces. Now, can you use them with some others? Certainly you can. Of course, you need to work towards those kind of things with caution. But just know that you could spend very little or you could spend quite a bit on a manual, depending on what it is you're wanting to do with it. The Lyman manual, which I checked, and it's their 51st edition that's out right now, is only about $26 for the paperback. If I was going to recommend a manual to somebody, it would be the Lyman first and Richard Lee's book second. And it wouldn't hurt you to have both. You saw that I do. All right, so moving on from there, you need primers. And this is something else to take into consideration. For the past few years, primers have been in short supply on the retail market. Now, they've been available, but there was a shortage of them back during the pandemic that just now is starting to rebound. And one thing about those and components in general, and when I say components, I mean the things that go inside the cartridge that you're trying to load, the price on that stuff has gone up significantly, which goes back to what I mentioned at the beginning, and that is that if you're planning on reloading for economy, it takes a long time to get back into the black with that. You're going to be in the red for quite a while. A brick of primers back when I started reloading back in the day was only like $17, $18, and now that same brick of primers on Midway USA is $82.99, and that's their special price. But then you have to take into consideration that when you order primers off of the internet, Not only do you have to pay shipping, you have to pay a hazmat fee on those as well. You look over here, you'll see it's like $119 to be able to get that brick of primers. So primers and powder, it's best if you're going to order that stuff online that you try to order it from the same distributor and order them at the same time so you can only pay one hazmat fee. But also, sometimes it's just better if you have a gun shop in your local community that caters to reloading. You're going to pay a couple dollars more for the item on the shelf, but in the long run, unless you're buying a significant amount, it's going to be cheaper than paying the hazmat fees online. Now, along with the primers, you need to have a priming tool, and there's several different kinds. Most presses, whether it's a single stage or a turret press, come with some kind of priming tool on them, and usually those aren't real efficient. You're a lot better off with one of these hand units or some kind of bench-mounted unit that automatically feeds the primers into it. It's just easier when you're batch reloading or when you're loading more than 20 or 30 rounds at a time. I really like those, and they don't cost a great deal. Moving on from that, the next thing you need is powder. We kind of touched on that when I was rambling about the hazmat. Just to put it in perspective for you, you might think, well, I bought a jug of powder. What else do I need? Well, if you were loading the 308 Winchester, which is kind of what I was going to gear this around, I'm not sure if I mentioned that yet or not, but the 308 is a real common rifle round, and a lot of people load for it. So with that in mind, let's say the powder that you're loading for took somewhere around 50 grains of powder for one cartridge. There are 7,000 grains of powder in a pound. So you would only get 140 cartridges out of 1 pound of powder. Now that powder, depending on whether it's rifle powder, pistol powder, if it's single-based, double-based, extruded, or ball type, or let's not get in the weeds on that. Powder is expensive these days. You're looking at anywhere between about $50 on up for a pound. I think most like regular powders that are available around here are between $50 and $75 a pound. An example I'll give you is Reloader 15.5, which is a relatively new powder on the market. 1 pound of that is $67.99, or you can get an 8-pound jug for $489. So depending on how much you're planning on using it and how much you're going to be shooting, it's cheaper if you can buy it in bulk, significantly so. And it's also one of those things that if you're going to order it online, order enough to make it worth your while when it comes to paying hazmat fees. Let's move on from the powder. Now let's talk about bullets. Now, there are a wide variety of different bullets available, and then there's, you can even cast your own if you want to, but we're not going to get into that because that's not what the brand new Reloader is going to be doing, right? No, we're going to talk about stuff that's readily available. And on the 308 Winchester, one of the very popular bullets that's on the market for that is the Hornady ELDX bullet. That is a hunting bullet that has similar properties to one of their match bullets, and there's factory ammunition that's loaded with that, but it's also a popular choice for the hand loader for the 308 caliber. I think the most common ELDX bullet weight is the 178 grain bullet. And then for that particular type projectile, depending on the weight and the caliber, you're looking at anywhere between $43.99 to $50.99 for that box. Now, with that in mind, a loaded box of 20 rounds of that ammunition is more than $40. You're probably looking at about $50 for the box. So the individual projectiles are significantly less than that, but bear in mind, that's assuming you have brass and powder and primers that all go into that. So there's not a huge cost benefit to what a hand-loaded round is worth versus what a factory round goes for. If you have a coupon or you buy something on sale, you might actually save a little bit on the factory-loaded stuff in some circumstances. Just know that the economical benefit that used to exist with hand loading isn't what it used to be. Moving on from that, there's brass, and probably the biggest advice I could give you when it comes to brass would be, especially when you're starting out and you're first trying to figure out how this stuff works, stick to brass. And what I mean by that is like these here are some empty pieces of brass that came from some factory loaded ammunition that I fired myself through my rifle. Now, I know for a fact, because I'm the one that did it, those pieces of brass have only ever been fired one time, and they were fired out of the same rifle that I'm going to be reloading them for. If you are trying to source your brass by scrounging around at the public range or something like that, I would advise you to use an extreme amount of caution, because something that I have seen happen in the past is you'll have either weapons that have out of spec chambers that cause damage to brass, or you'll have the old hand loader that has reloaded his brass so many times that now it's not real good anymore. So instead of disposing of it in a manner that somebody's not likely to try to reuse it, he just throws it in the brass bin at the range. Well, for the unsuspecting novice hand loader to come up and find that brass and think it, and we'll try that in English, and to think that it's good, he might be disappointed when he has a case head separate inside the chamber of his nice rifle or something like that. So I would advise that you either reuse brass that you have fired from the factory ammunition, or that you stick to new brass that you have purchased, at least until you have learned well the signs to look for on deterioration in brass. With that in mind, I would suggest that you stick to Starline brass if you can. It's more economical. Starline actually provides brass for a lot of boutique ammunition companies. For the 308 Winchester, 50 pieces of Starline brass is $28.99. By comparison, Hornady brass for the same amount is $42.99. So you're looking at 58 cents a piece versus 86 cents a piece just in those two. And if you move up to like Norma or Lapua, there's a lot of different types of brass that are on the market that you might pay as much, if not more, for that piece of brass as what you paid for a factory loaded box of shells. So just keep that in mind. While we're on the subject of brass, while you can get away without it for the most part, if you are going to reload brass, you need to be able to clean that brass. The most common way that reloaders will clean their brass is with some kind of vibratory tumbler like this Frankfurt Arsenal Quick and Easy. I have had several of those over the years. They don't last forever, especially if you're like me and you have a tendency to overload them. You can figure that you'll get anywhere from 2 or 3 up to about 5 years out of one of those before the motor burns up on it and you have to replace it. I think they used to be around $45. Now they're up a little over $100 for the little kit there, but that'll get you started on case cleaning. There are several other ways to do it. I'm a big fan of the wet tumblers that use the little steel pins. Those work really nice, and they have a larger capacity than what a vibratory tumbler has, but that's a significant investment that I wouldn't recommend on the novice reloader. Let's see here.
A few moments later.
You look right down here, I've got a set of calipers. That's something else that I consider to be absolutely mandatory when you're setting up. When you're loading your ammunition, you have to be aware of the overall length of your cartridges. And the easiest way to do that is with a set of calipers. Now there's digital ones and then there's analog calipers. Some people like the digital ones for convenience. Most of them require batteries. I personally am kind of a fan of the old dial style analog calipers. I am just more comfortable knowing that I don't have to worry about the battery going dead on my calipers and not having the right size little button cell to finish loading a box of ammunition the night before a match. So take that for what it's worth. I can actually look over here and I can see that I didn't even talk about this reloading block. A bench block like this is not completely necessary, but is very nice when it comes to keeping your cases upright and in order when you're loading them. Okay, so now that we've kind of talked about the stuff that you need, let's get back over to presses. If you were planning on only loading for a rifle and you were only going to be loading for one caliber, you could get away with a single stage press like this one over here. This is a Lee Precision Press. This is a Lee Precision Press. This is a Lee Precision Press. And while 3 out of the 4 of them that are mounted to my bench are Lee Precision, I'm in no way endorsed or compensated by them to endorse their products. I've just been using Lee products for a long time, and they work really well. I also use RCBS. I also use Lyman. I also use Redding. There are several other companies that manufacture really good quality reloading components or equipment, but by far and large, Lee Precision is one of the better values. And if you're just starting out and you're not even sure it's going to be something that you're going to want to do forever, I would suggest that you stick with something like that, because for the investment that you're going to make in the equipment, you're really going to get your money's worth. A good example, I've got this old 3-hole Lee Classic turret press here that a friend of mine gave this to me. I was a young guy. He probably gave it to me 25 years ago, and it was used when he gave it to me, and I still use it. It's mounted in the middle of my bench. I use it all the time, and it just goes to show that if you maintain it, if you take care of it, it'll last a lifetime. If you are going to be loading for pistol or you're going to be loading for multiple calibers, then a turret press like this one is really, I think, the way to go. Now, this, as I mentioned before, is a 3-hole turret. Lee actually doesn't make that 3-hole turret press anymore. Now they have a 4-hole, and that's just because, as I mentioned earlier when talking about the dies, a lot of the dies now have a separate crimp die that comes with them, which changed them from being 3 die sets to 4 die sets, or from being 2 die sets to 3 die sets. And depending on what it is you're doing with it, sometimes it's nice to have a separate decapper, or there may be some other reason why you want to have an extra die mounted on your press, and the turret press allows you to do that, and you can quickly and easily change between the die that you're using on the machine without having to make too many adjustments. Most of the single stage presses like this one anymore have some kind of option for a bushing. Like this one here has a bushing that just locks into place, and you put your die into that bushing, and that way you don't have to make all of the adjustments on the die each and every time you try to set it up. Now, we're not going to cover adjustments or anything else in this video. Just know that the traditional way of putting a die in a press was you had to put the die in and then you had to set it up. And quite often when you were setting up your dies, you might mess up one of the cartridge cases, or you might have to go back 2 or 3 times to fine tune it to get it the way you want it. Whereas with the bushings or with these little turret plates, you can kind of sort of set them and forget them. There's certainly exceptions to that, but typically speaking, it's a lot more solid state than what the options were years ago. You can get a 4-hole turret press like this one with the kit, which includes most of the small accessories that you would have to buy separately. Otherwise, you get the priming tool, the powder measure, case lube, case trimmer. There's several things that come with that. You can get the 4-hole Lee Precision set. See, I wrote it down, $242.99 over on Midway. It would be hard to find a better deal than that. And with a setup like that, it would give you all of the tools, with the exception of the case cleaning stuff that we talked about. Right there with the kit, you'd have an economy grade powder measure, you'd have an economy grade beam scale, and you'd have a priming tool setup that was a step above a single feed primer, all wrapped into that. If you wanted to stick with a single stage press, you could get the Challenger press kit. That's this one right here. You could get the entire kit for $164.99. Now, I would say that my advice to most folks would be go ahead and get the turret press, because it gives you more options later on down the road. But if you really are only going to be loading for that one rifle, the Challenger press would probably work out okay. I have really carried on a little longer than I thought I was going to get this information out to you. Hopefully, you understand a little better now some of the equipment that a person has to have just to kind of stick their toes in the water when it comes to cartridge reloading. By no means is this an exhaustive list that you should consider the end-all be-all. It's just a basic set of ideas and a thought process on what's necessary to get started with it. Now, there's certainly more to it. We'll cover that more in the future. Let me know what you think down below. And as always, take care and God bless.